She left her grandmother's house with a smile and was never seen alive again. A young girl, betrayed by the very people she trusted, walked into an apartment in Charlotte and into a nightmare. What happened behind those walls was so cruel, so horrifying, that even the detectives who worked the case could never forget it. This is the true story of Mary Collins, a story of trust, betrayal, and the desperate fight for justice. It was a quiet evening in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind where streetlights flickered on against the fading sun and the air carried the smell of spring. Mary Collins, a 20-year-old with a kind heart and a trusting nature, left her grandmother's apartment that night with a smile. She wore her favorite red scarf, the one her grandmother had knitted for her, and promised she would be back soon. She was going to see friends, she explained. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Just friends. Mary lived a simple life. She had her challenges. She had a mild disability that made her more trusting than most, but those who knew her loved her innocence. Her grandmother was protective, always reminding her to be careful, always asking her to check in. That night, Mary assured her everything would be fine. With that, she disappeared into the evening, her footsteps fading down the block. Hours passed, then a full night. By the next morning, Mary had not returned. Her grandmother grew anxious, pacing the living room, calling Mary's phone again and again. There was no answer. At first, she told herself not to panic. Mary had stayed out before. Maybe she was safe with friends. Maybe she had lost track of time. But deep down, an unease began to grow, a gnawing feeling that something was wrong. When the police were contacted, they treated it as a missing persons case. But at first there was little urgency. Young people go missing, they said. Sometimes they come back on their own. Flyers went up around Charlotte with Mary's smiling face, her bright eyes, her brown hair falling gently around her shoulders. Strangers shared her picture online, urging others to help find her. The city began to search, but as the days passed, hope started to dim. Witnesses came forward saying they had seen Mary with 3 people the night she disappeared: Kelly Lavery, a young woman she considered a friend, and 2 men, Donnie and Michael. Neighbors described seeing them all entering an apartment together. After that, no one saw Mary again. Detectives began to dig deeper. Who were these people Mary trusted enough to follow? What had happened inside that apartment? Slowly, rumors swirled. Some said there had been a party. Others whispered about drugs, about things getting out of hand. What no one could deny was that Mary had gone inside, and she never came out. Mary's grandmother clung to hope, but her instincts told her the truth. Each time the phone rang, her heart jumped, only to break again when it wasn't Mary. She replayed the last conversation in her mind, the smile, the promise to come home, the red scarf wrapped snugly around her granddaughter's neck. She couldn't shake the image of Mary walking into the night, completely unaware of the danger that awaited her. The police obtained a warrant and entered the apartment where Mary was last seen. What they found inside would change the case forever. The scent of bleach was overpowering, stimming their eyes, making them cough. Someone had tried hard to clean, to cover up what had happened. But blood leaves traces, and it was everywhere. On the carpet, along the baseboards, in the bathtub. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the violence. The detectives exchanged grim looks. There was no sign of Mary, no body, no belongings. But the evidence was undeniable. Something terrible had happened here. Something deliberate and brutal. And so the search for Mary Collins was no longer a search for a missing girl. It had become something darker. It had become the search for a killer. Detectives stood inside the apartment, their gloves stained with the invisible evidence they knew clung to every surface. The smell of bleach was suffocating, sharp enough to burn the throat. Someone had spent hours scrubbing, but no amount of cleaning could erase the truth. The carpet fibers still revealed traces of blood. Under the bathtub rim, flecks of red clung stubbornly. It was Mary's blood. The discovery shifted the entire case. What had begun as a missing persons report was now a homicide investigation. The three people last seen with Mary, Kelly, Lavery, Donnie, and Michael, became the prime suspects. Their names were whispered in every corner of Charlotte. To Mary's grandmother. They were no longer friends of her granddaughter. They were monsters who had taken her away. Police quickly tracked them down. Kelly was the first to be brought in. Sitting across from detectives in a sterile, windowless room, she tried to keep her voice steady. She repeated the same story again and again. Mary had left on her own. She didn't know where she had gone. But her eyes darted nervously toward the camera in the corner, and her hands twisted in her lap. She looked less like someone telling the truth, and more like someone clinging desperately to a lie. Donnie and Michael were brought in separately. Donnie's confidence cracked almost immediately. He paced the room, sweat collecting on his forehead, muttering that things had gotten out of hand. Michael, quieter, sat with his head down, avoiding every question, as if silence could shield him from guilt. Their fragmented words gave detectives a chilling outline of what had happened. Mary had walked willingly into the apartment that night. She trusted Kelly. She thought she was among friends. But once inside, the atmosphere shifted. She was pressured with drugs, mocked when she refused, cornered when she resisted. The night spiraled into violence. She was beaten, restrained, humiliated. The bathtub where detectives had found so much blood was where Mary fought for her life, and lost. For investigators hardened by years of crime scenes, the cruelty of this case was almost too much to bear. This was not a mistake. This was not an accident. It was deliberate, drawn out, merciless. But even with the evidence, one haunting question remained: where was Mary's body? The suspects offered nothing. Kelly shook her head, lips pressed tightly together. Donnie muttered half-truths but never revealed enough. Michael stayed silent, as though words themselves were dangerous. Without a body, the case grew more difficult. Prosecutors knew jurors often struggled to convict without seeing a victim. Yet detectives were determined. The blood, the lies, the attempted cover-up, it was enough to prove Mary had been murdered. Outside the police station, Charlotte held its breath. The community had already begun to mourn, but there was no closure, no place to grieve. Candlelight vigils filled the nights, crowds gathering to hold pictures of Mary, their faces illuminated by soft flames. People whispered prayers, sang songs, promised not to forget her. Strangers who had never met her felt the ache of her absence. Mary's grandmother refused to give up. Each day she sat by the phone, praying for news, gripping the scarf Mary had worn that night. Reporters crowded outside her door, their questions sharp and endless, but she answered only one. "I just want my granddaughter home. I want to give her the goodbye she deserves." Detectives pushed harder, determined to break through the suspects' walls of silence. They knew the truth was there, hidden in their fractured words and guilty eyes. They just had to drag it into the light. And as the investigation deepened, the horrifying details of Mary's final hours began to emerge, painting a picture darker than anyone had imagined. The interrogation rooms at the Charlotte Police Department had seen countless suspects before. But there was something uniquely unsettling about these three. Detectives rotated in and out, applying pressure, offering deals, even sitting in silence just to watch them squirm. Every gesture, every word was recorded. Every hesitation carefully noted. Kelly sat with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her gaze fixed on the table. She tried to appear calm, but her voice betrayed her. "I didn't do anything," she repeated over and over. She left. "I don't know where she went." Yet detectives pointed out the blood evidence, the bleach, the neighbors who heard screams. Her story cracked like glass under pressure, but still she refused to admit the truth. Donnie was different. His words tumbled out in bursts, defensive one moment, apologetic the next. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. He whispered once, eyes darting toward the mirror, behind which detectives observed. Nobody meant for it to go so far. But when pressed to explain what he meant, he clammed up, burying his face in his hands. Michael said the least. but his silence spoke volumes. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched, as though trying to disappear into himself. When detectives showed him photographs of the bloodstains, his jaw clenched. When they asked about Mary's last moments, his eyes flickered. Betraying the memories, he refused to speak aloud. Despite their silence, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Forensics filled in the gaps. Experts testified that Mary's blood was found not only in the bathtub, but also embedded deep in the fibers of the carpet. There were signs of a violent struggle, signs she had fought back with everything she had. Investigators could almost reconstruct the nightmare Mary, realizing too late the danger she was in, trying desperately to escape. But escape never came. The brutality she endured was shocking even to seasoned officers. It wasn't just an attack. It was cruelty for cruelty's sake. Each new detail that surfaced only deepened the horror. Yet without a body, the case remained fragile. Prosecutors feared that jurors might cling to the sliver of doubt. What if Mary had simply disappeared? What if she was still alive? Detectives knew better, but in court, evidence had to be undeniable. The suspects clung to that weakness like lifelines. Kelly's attorney argued she was being scapegoated, that she had been manipulated by the men. Donnie's lawyer suggested his client was guilty of poor choices, not murder. Michael's defense strategy was silence, hoping that saying nothing would leave fewer threads for prosecutors to pull. Still, the weight of evidence grew heavier. Witnesses came forward. A neighbor recalled hearing a woman's muffled screams late at night. Another remembered seeing the suspects carry bags of cleaning supplies into the apartment. One even swore they heard a panicked voice cry, "Please stop," before the noise was cut off. The community's outrage swelled. Each new revelation spread through Charlotte like wildfire. People demanded justice, demanded answers. How could 3 young adults, people Mary had once trusted, commit something so monstrous? And why would they refuse to reveal what they had done with her body? For Mary's grandmother, the waiting was agony. Every night she sat in the living room with the television on, not for comfort but to drown out the silence. She clutched Mary's photographs, whispering prayers through tears. She wanted the truth. She wanted to bring her granddaughter home. But all she had were shadows of answers and the growing certainty that Mary was gone forever. Detectives pressed forward, building their case piece by piece, knowing they might have to go to trial without the one thing everyone wanted most, Mary's return. And as the investigation pushed toward its final stages, the horrifying truth of her last hours was beginning to take shape. The pieces of Mary's final night began to form a picture that chilled everyone involved. Detectives relied on forensics, interviews, and the broken fragments of confessions to reconstruct her last hours inside that apartment. What emerged was not simply a murder, but a slow, deliberate act of cruelty. Mary had trusted Kelly. She had walked into the apartment with no fear, expecting a night with friends. But once the door closed behind her, the tone shifted. Detectives believed the taunts began first, mocking her gentle nature, ridiculing her disability, pushing her with substances she didn't want. When she resisted, the laughter turned darker. She was no longer a guest. She had become a target. The bathtub, later found stained with blood, told part of the story. Mary was forced inside, held down, struck when she tried to climb out. She begged them to stop. At least one neighbor heard her voice through the thin walls. Forensics confirmed her blood had sprayed across the tiles, seeped into the grout, clung even beneath the rim of the tub, where the bleach had failed to reach. Each mark was a silent witness, refusing to disappear. The brutality did not stop there. Detectives believed she was dragged out, struck again, left bleeding on the carpet. Strands of her hair were recovered from the floor, torn loose in the struggle. Even the cleaning supplies betrayed the killers. Traces of diluted bleach on sponges and rags carried microscopic remnants of her DNA. Science spoke where the suspects would not. The hardest details to hear came from witnesses who later broke their silence. a neighbor testified to hearing a woman's cries cut short, followed by heavy thumps and dragging sounds. Another recalled seeing Donnie leave the apartment with garbage bags long after midnight, his face pale, his steps quick. The weight of what they carried that night has never been fully revealed. For Mary's grandmother, the truth was unbearable. She listened in horror as investigators explained how long Mary may have suffered, how she fought back with all the strength she had, yet she also clung to the idea that even in her final moments, Mary's spirit remained unbroken. She was a fighter, her grandmother whispered. She wouldn't just give up. Detectives were haunted by the same thought. Mary had been betrayed in the cruelest way possible, not by strangers, but by people she trusted. Kelly's presence was perhaps the most shocking. A friend who should have protected her instead joined in the brutality. Her betrayal cut deeper than the violence itself. The lack of a body continued to torment the investigation. Search teams scoured wooded areas, landfills, abandoned buildings, but no trace of Mary was ever found. The suspects offered nothing. Kelly kept repeating, "I don't know," while Donnie and Michael stared blankly at the floor. It was as if they had erased her twice, once from life, and again from the world itself. Still, detectives refused to let the absence of a body erase the crime. They gathered every ounce of evidence, every statement, every forensic report. The bathtub became the centerpiece of their case, an object so ordinary, yet forever stained by horror. When the findings were presented to prosecutors, there was no hesitation. They would push forward with murder charges. "The body may be missing," one detective said. But the truth is written on every wall of that apartment. The case was now strong enough to go to court. The suspects would face a jury, and the details of Mary's suffering would be laid bare for the world to hear. The courtroom in Charlotte was filled to the brim, every seat occupied, every hallway crowded with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who had come simply to bear witness. The air was heavy, not with noise but with anticipation. For months, the community had waited for this moment. Now, the three suspects, Kelly, Lavery, Donnie, and Michael, sat side by side, their expressions grim, their futures hanging by a thread. Mary's family filled the first row. Her grandmother sat in the middle, clutching a photograph of Mary in both hands. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, yet her posture was straight, her resolve unbroken. She had promised herself that no matter how painful it became, she would hear every word, every detail. Mary had fought until the end, and now she would fight for her. The prosecution began with the evidence. Photographs of the apartment flashed on a screen, the bathtub streaked with faint traces of blood, the carpet where stains had soaked into the fibers, the rags soaked in bleach. Each image drew gasps from the jury, each detail a reminder of the brutality hidden behind locked doors. Experts took the stand. Forensic scientists explained how DNA tests confirmed the blood belonged to Mary Collins. Crime scene investigators described the overpowering smell of chemicals, proof of an attempted cover-up. Neighbors testified to the screams, the dragging sounds, the sight of Donnie carrying suspicious bags into the night. Each testimony was a piece of the puzzle, and together they built an image too horrifying to ignore. The defense countered with desperation. Kelly's attorney painted her as manipulated, insisting she had been pressured by the men. Donnie's lawyer argued that drugs and poor judgment had led to tragedy, but not premeditated murder. Michael's attorney tried to use silence as a shield, claiming the lack of a body meant the state could not prove death beyond doubt. But the jurors were not blind to the truth. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood, the bleach, the neighbors' accounts. It all told the same story. Mary had entered that apartment alive, and she had never left. Mary's grandmother testified too. Her voice trembled as she described the last night she saw her granddaughter, the way Mary smiled and promised she'd return. She spoke of the endless nights waiting for a call, the constant ache of not knowing where Mary's body lay. The courtroom fell silent as she clutched the red scarf in her hands, holding it as if it were the last piece of Mary she could still touch. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. The trial became more than a legal battle. It was a public reckoning. People across the city followed each day's updates, their anger mounting, their sympathy for Mary's family deepening. As closing arguments approached, the prosecutor stood before the jury with quiet conviction. He pointed at the defendants, his voice steady but sharp. Mary Collins walked into that apartment because she trusted them. And for that trust, she was mocked, tortured, and murdered. They may have tried to erase the evidence, they may have hidden her body, but the truth remains. You cannot wash away guilt. You cannot bleach away a life. The jurors listened intently, their faces somber. The weight of justice rested in their hands. When the gavel struck, signaling the end of testimony, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Mary's family held one another, bracing themselves for the verdict to come. After months of sorrow, they were closer than ever to the answer. They had prayed for justice for Mary Collins. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like days. Every second ticked louder than the last, echoing in the hearts of Mary's family who sat in silence, waiting. At last the doors opened and 12 jurors filed back into the courtroom. The room went still, no coughs, no whispers. Only the faint creak of chairs as everyone leaned forward. The foreman stood, holding the verdict slip in his trembling hands. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of finality. We, the jury, find the defendants guilty of first-degree murder. Mary's grandmother closed her eyes and clutched the photograph of her granddaughter against her chest. Tears ran freely down her face, a mix of grief and relief. Around her, supporters whispered prayers of thanks. The silence broke into muffled sobs as the judge confirmed what the family had prayed for: justice had been served. The judge's sentencing was equally firm. Each defendant, Kelly Lavery, Donnie, and Michael, was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom gasped at the severity. But for Mary's family, it was the only sentence that mattered. You will spend the rest of your days behind bars, the judge declared. You took a life with cruelty, and society will never again trust you with freedom. Kelly wept, covering her face in her hands. Donnie stared ahead in silence, his jaw clenched, while Michael sank into his chair as if the weight of the words crushed him. Yet for all their displays of regret, not one of them had ever revealed where Mary's body was hidden. That wound remained open, a cruel reminder that some truths had been buried forever. Despite this, the verdict gave the family something they had long been denied: recognition that Mary's life mattered, that her suffering was not forgotten, and that those responsible had been held accountable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to capture the reactions. Mary's grandmother stood at the steps, her voice steady despite the tears. "This does not bring Mary back," she said, holding up the red scarf her granddaughter once wore. "But it tells the world that her life was worth something. She was loved, and she will be remembered. Justice has spoken." The story of Mary Collins spread far beyond Charlotte. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about the young woman with a gentle heart whose life had been stolen by people she trusted. Advocacy groups spoke her name at rallies, calling for stronger protections for vulnerable young women. Mary had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol, a reminder of resilience and the demand for justice. In the years that followed, her family kept her memory alive. They created scholarships in her name, organized community events, and shared her story with anyone willing to listen. Each effort was a way of making sure that Mary's voice, though silenced, still echoed in the world. Detectives who worked the case admitted that it never left them. They would remember the evidence, the photographs, the long nights chasing leads. But most of all, they remembered Mary, the young woman who deserved a full life, who deserved better friends, who deserved tomorrow. On anniversaries of her passing, the family gathered at candlelight vigils, holding up photographs of her smiling face. The community stood with them, candles flickering in the night, a sea of light against the darkness that had once swallowed Mary's final hours. Though her body was never found, Mary Collins had not disappeared. She lived on in memory, in love, and in the justice that bore her name. For her grandmother, the promise remained the same. Each night she whispered it softly, clutching Mary's red scarf. "I will never let them erase you. You will always be my girl." And with that vow, Mary's story endured, a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable cruelty, truth and justice can still prevail. Mary Collins' body was never found, but her story refuses to disappear. Justice may have locked her killers away, yet the scars of her betrayal remain carved into the memory of an entire community. Mary's smile, her kindness, her dreams, they were stolen far too soon. But as long as her name is spoken, she lives on. This is not just the story of her death, it is the story of her legacy. A reminder that even in the darkest cruelty, truth can rise and justice can prevail.